Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to go to Tucson, Arizona, and talk about um, migration and especially the immigrants to the U.S. from the southern border, the Latin Americans mostly coming into the U.S. And this is a topic that we have not covered before in our whole series of shows. We've talked about migrants in Europe, but this guy is going to tell me all about, and he's a real specialist. So, hello, John Washington.
Hello, Meta. Really glad to be talking to you.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to get right down to work because in a few days we're going to have you guys are going to have a new president. I kind of ambivalent because I am a dual citizen. And so he's my president too, but I don't really quite want to acknowledge that. And we're going to have a new prime minister one of these times soon,
Sure.
also. So there will be quite a turnover in
Lots of
world
change.
history immediately. Okay, now as I understand it, of course, from my perch here in Toronto, the probably the main people wanting to support Trump all along have been folks who have a real grudge against immigrants, who are really not enthusiastic about immigrants. And I don't understand that. Um, and you do. And if anybody does, you do. I'm interested in the politics behind it. What's their grievance? What do most people fear that immigrants are doing to them? I mean, they must fear something on their own besides whatever stories that Trump has made up. There must be some either realistic or, at any rate, credible to them basis for worrying that immigrants are going to do them some harm. So, start at the top, sir, and give me your take on this whole kerfuffle.
Kerfuffle is putting it lightly. Yeah, I think that, you said that you have trouble understanding why people are aggrieved against migrants. And this is going to sound patronizing, but I have spoken with a lot of people who support immigration restrictionist measures, who are supporting Trump and his agenda of mass deportations. And it seems to me like they themselves often do not understand why they are aggrieved against migrants. And I think the way that I see it is that people have legitimate grievances. There are certainly problems in American society, including job insecurity, including wages that are not rising, including rising housing prices, including political instability, including genuine concern, whether admitted or not, about climate change, and among many others, changing social dynamics, changes in society, and lack of societal cohesion. Huge changes have been happening, and legitimate issues are present. And I think that politicians have used those grievances and been able to spin them around and foist them on the backs of migrants. And that has become, over the last, especially three, four presidential campaigns, increasingly a winning campaign strategy, a successful campaign strategy. And migrants are being scapegoated in the process. They are being blamed for things like wages that are not rising or job insecurity, the list of things I just named, when in reality, they are not causing those problems. In fact, in many regards, and this is something I get deep into in my book, they could be and sometimes are the solutions to those problems. But they are very convenient targets. And they're convenient targets because we have a long history in this country and elsewhere of pinning on the backs of an other, especially a darker skinned other, someone not originally from this place, a lot of our own society's ills.
Mhm.
And I think this is the issue. And it's not just me sitting here at my desk, sort of trying to understand these political dynamics, but I'm a reporter. I report for a local community outlet called Arizona Luminaria. I do a lot of reporting on top of that for the books that I write. And I have been talking to people, voters on both sides and migrants themselves for years. And especially in this most recent campaign, I went to a number of rallies. I went to Trump rally, Vance rally, rallies for the other side, for the Democrats in Tucson and elsewhere. And I would talk to voters and say, how do you think about the border right now? Or, what is driving you to come out to drive 3 hours from rural Arizona to come to Tucson to see Trump speak at this venue? And people's number one complaint or number one concern often was the border. And they would say, it's being overrun, we're being invaded. And I would ask them, well, have you seen any effects of this personally? Have you been affected? Have you been negatively impacted in any way? And almost zero people could say that they had been. Um, some people would say, look, I'm too scared now to go for walks at night in my community because of migrants. I'd be like, well, we know that in Tucson, where this person was living, was telling me this, you know, crime, assaults have gone down in recent years. And we know too, statistically speaking, that migrants commit far fewer crimes than native-born residents. So, what exactly is it you fear? What have you seen that has caused you to tremble and stay inside instead of go for your nightly walk? And they couldn't point me to anything. It was rather the rhetoric that has been espoused and just constantly, just like bellowed out of politicians' microphones for the past year or many years. One man who I asked, okay, your number one concern is the border. He was a Trump supporter at I think this was a JD Vance rally. I said, so your number one concern is the border. How has it affected you personally? And he thought about it and he gave me a really honest answer that I think about a lot. He said, well, it's affected my attitude. And
Mm.
that was as far as it's been able to. That is as far as it has actually affected him. It's affected his mentality, his mindset, his way of seeing the world, but it hasn't, in fact, affected him personally in any substantive way. So I think what is happening is there are all of these underlying, again, very serious problems, rising inequality and political strife. And rather than dealing with them, which are very complex issues and would take maybe a very serious transformation of the way that we run our country or that we conduct, political affairs and foreign policy, rather than actually address them, we are just blaming them on this very convenient, marginalized group of people.
I want to give my reaction in terms of my friends. I have two friends who have something that may be relevant to this issue. One is a friend named Doug Saunders, who's a journalist with the Globe and Mail mostly, but been living in Berlin for the last few years. And he's got a book in press on migration, especially people from South America coming in all the way up through the Darien Pass and the whole gap and stuff, and coming, trying to get in the US and stuff. So you and he would have a good conversation, I'm sure.
Sounds like.
But he had previously published something about the migrants into Britain.
Mhm.
And he said that he was especially interested in the Muslims, of course, in Britain. And he said that the opposition to the migrants was exactly inversely related to their location. The more, the fewer migrants in an area, the more opposition there was to
Mhm.
the Muslims.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and he makes a good case, but he has come to the view that I share and have shared a long time, that the resentment, that the basis for the support for right wingers, Trump in the US, but right wingers all over the world, would be dictators, is not really economic. And it's really something else. Now, he doesn't say what else it is, but my friend Arlie Hochschild has a book called Strangers in Their Own Land, and then a new book called Stolen Pride, both of which make the same argument that a very important part of the resentment of white working class Americans has to do with the feeling that their status in as the stalwart yeoman of American society um, has been undermined by these newcomers, and that it's as if all the people in the U.S. are sort of standing in line to get to the top of the hill, the American dream, and all of these immigrants keep cutting in line and cutting in ahead of these people who've been standing patiently in line for centuries. And but it's not just the immigrants; it's also uh, all kinds of people who are making various kinds of claims
Mm.
for status that had been denied before. You know, women, crippled people, gays. You know, people, everybody with every disadvantaged person comes along and wants a place in line. And these people feel that they're being, you know, gypped of their rightful honor, their dignity, their status, their standing as basic American citizens.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with both of those ideas. The first one, Doug Saunders, that's premised on the idea of the concept of contact theory. And this is something that's been studied in the immigration field where the more contact you have, it's not just exclusive to immigration, but the more contact you have with immigrants, the more accepting of them you are. And actually, you fear them more when you know them less. And I think that is very much because of the way that they're typically portrayed, especially by either right-wing media or right-wing, anti-immigrant politicians who are trying to use that, again, scapegoating to their benefit. There have actually been studies in Germany of this case. There are rising resentments against immigrants in Germany, and in many cases, it is most intense in places where there are fewer immigrants. So, you don't see anti-immigrant animosity very much in New York City. Of course, it's there, but I lived in New York for a while, and one of the most diverse cities in on the planet. You see people from 100 plus countries living peacefully together. A lot of them are newcomers. A lot of hay was made about 100 plus thousand Venezuelans coming to New York City over the past couple of years. Most of them bussed by Governor Abbott in Texas, some by Governor DeSantis in Florida, and they were trying to get people upset. And the people that got upset were the politicians, not so much the people. Of course, some folks were mad and bought into the theory being espoused by the politicians, but in general, 100,000 people, injected into New York City is a pittance. Per capita, that is nothing compared to earlier waves of migration in the 1930s, in the early 1900s, and 1850s and 60s. The per capita migration rates were far higher than they were in the 2021, 22 when people were being bused there. So yeah, I think that your friend is exactly right. As for the status rather than economics driving, or the fear of losing status rather than economics driving, I think that is also a really valid point. I think one thing I'd add on is that, and you were starting to say this towards the end, it's not so much these previously marginalized groups, people of color, women who are, rightfully claiming equal status in our society. This is not something that they are taking from the people who previously, were dominating over them. This is something that rightly belongs to them and was otherwise and previously stolen from them. I think that's an important point to make. And the second is that the folks who now do feel threatened are not actually threatened by those people, by those previously marginalized groups. They are now being primarily threatened by the wealthy elite. The folks who lost their jobs in, the 80s and 90s in the Rust Belt, where I grew up. I grew up in Ohio. Um, those jobs were not taken by migrants. Those jobs were offshored or nearshored by corporate executives. And the losers in that were both the native workers in Ohio and outside of Pittsburgh and places like that. And the losers were also the people who were actually forced to move or compelled to move from different parts of Mexico and Latin America and were given dangerous, low paid, non unionized jobs in the maquila industry in northern Mexico. Those people, they have jobs, but actually the rates of wages in those jobs decreased in that same period where more and more companies were coming into northern Mexico. Unionization also went down, and worker safety also got really, really dangerous. So there were no winners except for the corporate executives. So those are the people who are threatening status and are putting the heel on the folks, the human, bootstrappers who you're talking about before, not the marginalized, not the migrants.
I want to talk about Trump some more, but mostly I want to hear what you've been doing, and that I know that you actually hang out with people and actually get to know the migrants and their situation.
Mhm.
Tell me about some of that.
Yeah, I've been reporting on the migrant trails for over a decade at this point. I have spent a lot of time in Central America and different parts of Mexico, riding the rails, staying in migrant shelters, hanging out, talking to people, befriending people. Then along the U.S.-Mexico border and some of the borders between, from Central America up to the U.S.-Mexico border, spending a lot of time understanding and talking to people who are crossing it. And, that includes human smugglers, that includes Border Patrol agents, people who are out there trying to help migrants, people out there trying to, like militia types who are trying to hunt migrants. And I think one thing that gets really lost, even in the conversation we've had so far, and I fault myself here, is you can talk about macro numbers and talk about migration trends in the abstract, but one thing that I think does not get emphasized enough is that this is affecting real people. And that right now, as you and I are sitting in our comfortable living rooms or offices, there are folks, tens of thousands of people, not too far from me right now, who are in dire straits, desperately trying to get across the border, who are waiting to gain asylum appointments and are in real danger. And it's not just a political football. It has immediate consequences. When right now our Senate is debating a bill, the Laken Riley Act, that would impose huge consequences on the way that people are arrested, detained, and potentially deported for being in the United States.
I have seen that name, but and been puzzled because I don't know who Lake and Riley is or what the whole issue is. Please explain.
Yeah. So Laken Riley was a young woman in Georgia. I think she was in her early 20s, who was murdered a couple years ago, and it was, yeah, an absolutely heinous crime and a tragic act that occurred. And she was murdered by an undocumented migrant from Venezuela. So is the allegation. He hasn't been convicted yet, but it seems that that's the case. And especially the right, the Republicans made a really big deal about this, and they not only blamed the alleged perpetrator, but were starting to blame all migrants, all undocumented migrants. It got to reach such a pitch that actually Joe Biden um, basically convicted the suspect in a State of the Union address that was, I think, believe 2 years ago now. And the man was previously arrested for theft and was released, and that is the sticking point for a lot of people on the right. Again, it is an absolute tragedy. It is a terrible thing that happened, and whoever did it, if it's this indeed this man, they should be brought to justice. But what has now happened is this bill has gained bipartisan support. In fact, it was co-sponsored by the newly elected Democratic senator from Arizona, Ruben Gallego, who previously had been or claimed to be a supporter of migrant rights. And now this bill, what it would do, it would create mandatory detention for migrants who are charged with, not convicted of, but charged with committing a whole host of petty crimes, including shoplifting. So if someone is in the country without documents and they are charged with stealing whatever from a gas station, they this law requires mandatory detention without bond, and this will cause a whole host of problems, including spoiling the potential criminal case. Because if they're in mandatory immigration detention, they won't be able to be released to face their criminal charges. So due process is basically thrown out the window. There's a bunch of other really problematic provisions in the law, and one other that is worth mentioning is that um, states have guaranteed standing, and that's a technical term for the ability to sue the federal government if they don't like how the federal government is enforcing immigration violations or immigration law, rather. So, one of the problems why the United States hasn't updated its immigration laws since the 1990s, since basically before the internet existed, which has, so much has changed over those decades. The reason that they haven't been able to do it is because there's been such bickering and infighting amongst both sides. And this bill will gum up the process even more. Nothing will be able to be passed, hardly. And anything that does get passed is going to be blocked or contested constantly, and the courts are just going to be having these constant battles. And meanwhile, we're going to be in the status quo with a backlog of over 1.5 million immigration cases in the court system, and the inability for people to gain legal status if they try to do it so-called the right way. So, I think what this shows is ignorance, maybe desperation as well on behalf of lawmakers. They just don't understand the circumstances right now. They don't understand the history of how we've gotten here, and this is going to very likely make things worse, not only politically but also for people who are going to get caught up in the system.
Okay, now you're predicting that there's not going to be any cooperation. If they, I don't quite, I mean, you say they bicker, but why are they bickering? If both sides more or less agree that there's something wrong that needs to be fixed, I don't know what there is to bicker about and why it's gone on so long. And of
Oh,
course, I don't.
they like the stance now is animosity. The stance is rejecting any sense of bipartisanship. Is the definition of a Democrat is an anti-Republican. The definition of a Republican is an anti-Democrat. I think that is what we've become largely. There are some exceptions to that. There are some, and they're minor. But especially in terms of a very hot topic like immigration, you cannot really be on the side of your supposed opponents. Though that is maybe in some sense starting to change because I think that I don't know. I think the Democrats have been capitulating and acquiescing on this point for a number of years, and it's become a whole hot mess.
Well, tell me what went wrong with Kamala Harris's assignment. I mean, that was her big chance to
Yeah.
show her stuff. She was supposed to solve the immigration problem, and didn't. But I never got an account of what she tried to do, what she wanted to do, and why she couldn't accomplish it, and would it have been any good anyway?
Well, she was not charged with solving all the immigration problems. She was solved with trying to address the root causes of out migration from Central America. So it was much more specific than trying to solve like the border. She was not the border czar by any means. That was a right-wing sort of smear campaign. I am not defending Kamala Harris's record on immigration or her role in Central America at all. But it is true. I have to, set the record straight that she was not charged with fixing the border. I would say the Biden Harris presidency, they came in promising to restore asylum. They came in promising not to build another foot of wall. They tried to issue a moratorium on deportations for 100 days. And that was their first weeks in office. Their last weeks and year in office was the polar opposite of that. And I think what happened is something we've already sort of addressed is they saw immigration as a means to run a campaign. They saw it as a political football and not as something that actually matters. They didn't see it as a matter of principle.
Who are you? You're talking about the Democrats.
That's right.
They
They
saw it that because they accused the Republicans of holding up the solution because the Republicans wanted to use it as a political football.
Right. I think that calling that a solution, that was a Senate bill that was passed in late 20, or that was, yeah, it was passed in late 2023 and then got sort of scuttled by Trump in early 2024. It wasn't a solution. What it was going to do was going to sort of dig in on the policies that are already in place, on attempting to further enforce and militarize the border, more surveillance technology, more border guards, raising the threshold for asylum, all of these failed policies that we have years, in fact, decades of evidence for that they just don't work very well. And so that was what they were holding up as the solution. And yeah, they're right to say that the Republicans sort of pulled the rug out of efforts to pass it. But after that, that bill went nowhere. Then the Biden administration, on its own, passed a series of regulations that did dramatically raise the threshold for asylum, and that is, rights organizations, the ACLU, and anyone who reads and understands international law recognize that is a clear violation of asylum protocols that the United States signed on to in the late 60s. That was basically a update of the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the Harris Biden administration and then the Harris campaign really turned its back on their previous commitments to stand up for human rights of migrants.
And they did it because the public opinion was really,
Yeah, I think the way that I see it is that Kamala Harris was trying to use immigration and use the politicking not to pave a way towards citizenship for the 13 to 15 million people who are undocumented and marginalized, but to pave a way her own way to the White House. She used it as a tool, and she, I think, really, really gave in to a lot of the most right-wing demands. I mean, if you look at her rhetoric from, 2024 leading up to November compared to her rhetoric in 2021 when she was in, the vice presidency, early in the vice presidency, or previous to that, it is a dramatic shift. I mean, really
yeah,
black
but
and white.
look, I mean, to be fair, you can't blame a politician for doing what the public wants them to do.
Well,
The voters want them to do it. I mean, I'm sorry, but the blame is on the stupid voter. And
I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with that. I blame the politicians. As a critic, as a reporter, as someone who digs in hard on this, I think that a lot of times as politicians as flag bearers actually lead this conversation and they spew misinformation. They agree to this framing of this, especially this issue, in a way that does not represent the reality and that I think turns backs on basic principles. I think that Kamala Harris could have, and I think she should have, stood on the principles that she previously espoused and said that I actually believe that migrants are human beings and deserve basic dignity and rights. And in effect, by the end of her campaign, she was no longer doing that.
well, okay, but she's not the only politician who's
No,
made these
by
moves.
no
All
means.
around the world, we have people worried about migration, and we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
I mean, when we get these, coastal, we're going to have 10 feet of ocean rise.
Mm,
Almost certainly. It's pretty well baked into the
yeah.
system now, unless they do something really dramatic by way of geoengineering. We're going to have 10 feet of ocean rise. The
Well,
coastal cities are
you're
going to
right.
be wiped out. All those people are going to have to go someplace. And boy, talk about what the issues of migration are like now. That's nothing compared to what's coming.
You're absolutely right. And right now, in just gross numbers, we have more people who are forcibly displaced than ever before in history. And we will see more and more of that, principally because of climate change and the strife that comes from it. So there's some numbers that I think are very telling. There was a study by the Transnational Institute that looked at a recent 5-year period where the United States spent 11 times more in border enforcement than in climate change mitigation. Canada was an even worse offender. I can't remember their exact numbers, but they spent, even more on on immigration enforcement measures than on climate change mitigation in countries that were seeing a lot of people leave. And let's say that you're
That's news to me. And I'm sorry to hear that. But lately, of course, public opinion in Canada has been shifting. We've always been very proud. I mean, have been very proud of the fact that immigrants are. It's been the best place for immigrants. Basically, they get a good boost when they come, and
well,
people have looked forward to them and have accepted. It's been a great place for immigrants. But no, now there's a reaction. People are saying that all our housing shortage is caused by all these immigrants taking spaces and whatnot, and you see it. My cleaning lady just was telling me how bad immigrants are, although she's an immigrant. She was a refugee from Yugoslavia. So there's a change of opinion globally, and not a very generous one. So, and I don't
well,
know what to make of it, but I mean, the very idea that Trump can talk about deporting all of those people is astounding that he would even make such a claim. But I don't know how far he's going to go with it. It still looks like he's going to try.
Well, I would challenge you a little bit on that claim of Canada. I'm definitely much less familiar with Canadian immigration policies, but refugee numbers, the number of people that Canada resettles. I know that there are some programs like sponsoring refugees, but overall, refugee numbers that Canada compared to many other countries is actually quite low. And there are also, maybe the quality of life once someone is able to resettle in Canada is far better and they are less often undocumented compared to the United States. But the sheer number of people that Canada is allowing in and has been allowing in is pretty low. Canada benefits in large part by this huge buffer zone called the United States. If Canada was on the border with Mexico, I wonder if things would be potentially quite different. So it's just a lot harder for people to get to Mexico, to Canada, than it is to the United States. But you're right. I mean, I think compared to the United States, Canada has historically done a better job. But yeah, I see the tide shifting as well. I want to make one other point about that, spending more on border enforcement or immigration restrictions than on climate change, is that if your ultimate goal, which mine is not, is to stop people from moving, stop people from migrating, that is not a winning strategy. Trying to stop people from moving from cataclysmic disasters and existential threats isn't done by building walls. It's done by addressing those root causes.
Mhm.
So if you really want to stop people from moving, you have to address climate change in a real way. And countries have not been doing that. Canada, the United States, and much of the Western world.
Mhm. I'm editor of Peace Magazine, and our January issue is late, but we will be distributing it probably today, emailing it, and you'll get one. But one of the
Right.
articles that we have is about Canada's bad record about asylum for for refugees, and I think the most shocking has to do with the our failure to stand by the Afghans who worked for Canadians and risked their lives and did a
Yep.
lot when the Canadian forces were there, and then those people have not been let into Canada. So this fellow is agreeing with you about refugees. But if you look at the immigrant uh, relations in general, I mean, they bring people in on point systems.
Mhm.
You get points for this and that good quality, and the record I think has been that the people coming into Canada have been given a better. It's been easier to assimilate into Canadian society and be accepted in general than certainly than in most of the European countries, where, again, the population, the number of people coming in, or not the number, but the sources. We had, a lot of, they have a lot of Muslims coming in and Africans coming in and so on. And I think those are the people who have been the forefront of attention in Europe as contrasted to the Latin Americans in the US. There aren't that many Latin Americans, I guess, in Canada, but anyway. Okay, now you mentioned something which I'd like to explore further. I think you were briefly alluding to the fact that you don't you don't think it's important to try to keep the borders intact and populations stable. I think what attracted me to something you wrote in the first place was that you were writing maybe a book review or something about the notion that maybe we could do without nations at all, that maintaining borders is and stable populations in any country is not necessarily your top priority, nor is it mine. I look to a day when the maybe we still have um, nations, but their importance is about like having counties in
Mhm.
a country. Yeah.
Mhm.
So tell me where you came from to that point of view, and am I inferring correctly that that is your belief?
Well, I think there's a distinction, and this is something that's important to understand as we move forward, between nations and states.
Mhm.
So right now, most of the world is divided up by, according to, what we call nation states, which is a combination of the two. But a state is a governmental entity, and it is a political jurisdictional boundary. The nation part of that is a little bit harder to define, and this refers to the identity of the population within that geographical boundary. The problem is that once you start trying to define a what is a nation, is you're going to immediately start excluding other people. So the United States, a lot of not everyone, and like even the founding fathers, not everyone agreed with this, but was basically founded along the lines of an Anglo-Saxon identity. And of course, if you look at the actual population at the founding of the United States, there were many people who were not Anglo-Saxon at all. There were, among others, Spaniards, Nordic people, and many, many indigenous people. And so the problem is that you try to draw these sort of identitarian boundaries, you're going to necessarily try to push people away. And especially in, 2025, we have incredibly mobile, heterogeneous populations. And you cannot, even the most smallest, most homogeneous nation states, like, say, smaller countries that are island nations like Japan, they're diverse. There's diversity there too, both ethnic, religious, and all sorts of it. And so I think that there's an inherent problem here, and I think we are being unnecessarily exclusive when we try to combine these two ideas, nation and state, together. I'm not against countries. In fact, I'm not even against borders. I think that it makes sense to divide to put up a political boundary and say, here is the Commonwealth, here is the group of people who are going to be organizing together, who are going to pay into a common pot, who will receive services, who will rely on each other, and even form some sort of, I think, organic identities that is not necessarily based on ethnicity. But that can be a part of it too. I mean, I grew up in a Romanian American enclave, basically in northern Ohio. And Romanian is a huge part of my identity. I'm proud of it, but I wouldn't try to build a border around those small communities and say no one else can come in. In fact, lots of people are coming in, and my identity and my mother's are very much not Romanian, but are Romanian American. And that second part of the hyphen, that second half of that double word there, is such a weird mongrel mix that I think is beautiful and wonderful. So I think that you can still maintain this sense of a boundary. You can still maintain order. And in fact, I think you would give more order to countries if you broke off that nation part of it. You would have states without nations. And here, what you do, and if the presumption is that people can move, people can come in, what they would do is they would register. Right now, we incentivize people to try to come in and hide because they're not allowed in. And yet they need to come in for various different reasons, or they want to come in for various different reasons.
When you
And
say
because
register,
registered, so come in through ports of
register,
entry.
admit that they are here, or
Yeah.
are you saying register, put down their identity as their voluntary choice of who they want to be considered, what nation they think they belong to? Those are two
I
different notions of registration.
Yeah, I mean register as in come through a port of entry, come through a designated border entry and say, here I'm moving to this place. And this is something, we don't have the border entry part, but when you move within a country right now, within the United States or within different, parts of Canada, you have to re-register to vote for your DMV, your driver's license. You have to, do all sorts of things. You pay taxes to different bodies. And the government knows where you are. They, in fact, need to know where you are. And in fact, you, in some regard, not all, want the government to know where you are so you can receive the benefits of, living in a communal society. And so that is what I mean by register. And I think that that would be a much more orderly system. And in fact, one of the other principal complaints that a lot of people have who say that the border's out of control, they claim that we are giving money, this out of control border is giving money to human smugglers or even human traffickers. But if people were allowed to move, they wouldn't need human smugglers. They would be able to walk up to the, country, knock on the door and say, here I am. And they wouldn't need to pay anyone thousands of dollars. They wouldn't need to, be extorted and submit themselves into incredibly violent organizations
And
to actually
let's
make the move.
explore that because I think that is where your assumptions are radical. I mean, if you believe that if we opened borders completely worldwide, the economies would survive and all kinds of good things would happen. Please explain how you think that would happen. I think most 99% of the people I know would say, yeah, the one thing that countries do need to have is some control over the borders so that they know who's there in the country and what the duties and responsibilities and rights of these inhabitants are and how they can plan for for their participation in society.
Exactly.
If you really open the borders, tell me, well, has it ever been done? And
Well,
tell me
I
what
agree. I agree with your friends, and my vision, and a lot of the vision of people who are promoting open borders, completely agree with your friends. They want the government to understand who's coming in. Open borders does not mean a free-for-all. Open borders means that there are places where people can come, they cross the border and they check in and they register there at those ports of entry or at those border controls. Um,
Where? Where do you
the
see that happen?
Where does that happen? Well, right now, along the U.S.-Mexico border, there are a number, a few dozen designated ports of entry, which is where when people with visas or who have are allowed to cross, they have to cross there. It's illegal to cross, just jump over in the desert from Arizona to Sonora. You're not allowed to do that, no matter whether
That's
you're a
that
U.S.
that
citizen.
then when you say they're open borders, that's not true. They're
No,
not open borders. If they
no,
if they have if they're filtered,
They though no, I think that we are, sort of splitting hairs on definition here. They are open, and the presumption is that people can move, and people would be allowed to move, but they would just have to cross in a orderly way. So, right now,
but I'm sorry, but didn't you say that not everybody can come in? I
no,
mean,
everybody can come in. That is the
everybody in
presumption.
the world can come in those borders?
Well, everyone who wants to, yeah. And the fear that I maybe hear you sort of leaning on is that too many people would come in. But actually, we have evidence that that wouldn't be the case. So most people right now in the world, and there has actually been polls taken, and there's been, social scientists who have studied this very carefully. Most people don't want to leave home. There are plenty of people who are compelled to leave home because of a number of the problems that we've already mentioned, climate change, political instability, etc. But most people without those issues would not leave. So I think that the numbers that are feared by that there would just be this absolute wave of people, wouldn't be borne out by reality. Two is that I think one important corollary to fighting for open borders is fighting for the right to remain. And this addresses the point I was just making, is that we have to also address these very serious underlying issues like growing inequality. If someone moves from Haiti to the United States, they'll make at least 25 times what they're making doing a similar job in Haiti. That's not right. Of course, that is going to compel people to try to move. And so you have to really try to understand what is causing that enormous difference. And you have to also try to understand history. You have to try to understand the way that foreign aid and foreign politics and foreign policy and foreign interventions are all happening right now, too. That is a important, in fact, essential piece of fighting for open borders. But look at right now. There's a couple examples we could look at very briefly. One is the number of people who have fled Venezuela in the last 5, 10 years. It is approaching over half. I mean, I think we've surpassed half of the population. Three-quarters of that are in neighboring countries, in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. Um, about 1 million, I think we've just gone over 1 million, have come to the United States. Most people want to stay close. They want to stay close so that they could potentially return to their homes. They can stay close to family. They remain in their cultures, in the cuisines and the languages that they're used to. Another example here is
Oh, wait a
in
minute. Don't
yeah.
skip over that because what I want to know is what's happened in those countries where they've gone. What has it done to, is it Colombia that's
Mhm.
accepted the most of the
Yeah,
Venezuelan?
Colombia is definitely accepted the most. It depends on what part of Colombia you look at, but Colombia's economy has not collapsed because of a few million Venezuelans who have come in. Colombia has a number of underlying problems, including like a decades-long insurgent warfare, simmering warfare. But Venezuelans have not posed a threat to Colombia. There are different parts of Colombia that have reacted in against Colombians, but overall they've been able to assimilate. They overall, when they've been given the chance, they've been able to resettle. Many of them are doing so what they as they see temporarily.
Well, also,
And
as I recall, Angela Merkel allowed a lot of 1 million people came all of a sudden into Germany, and now that must have I don't know how much that affected the popularity of her regime, but she survived for several years. Over now, looking backwards, what would most Germans say has been the overall effect of admitting so many immigrants all of a sudden?
You know what it did? I think go back to one of the things that gentleman told me when I was covering the Vance campaign. I think it affected their attitude. What it did not affect, it did not tank the German economy. It did not lead to rising rates of crime. There were some crimes committed by some of those migrants that the German and international press made a huge deal out of, but overall the crime rates have stabilized, in fact, gone down. I looked at different parts of Germany very carefully, and wages did not decrease for native German-born residents. Unemployment did not go up. Germany, in regard to its economy, has been on the same track that it was on before. Other things have changed. Politically, it's a god awful mess right now, but um, that is not to blame for the actual effects of the migrants. Maybe in part the attitudinal effect of welcoming migrants. So, there have been lots and lots of studies of huge and numbers of people over short periods of time moving to um, different parts of Miami, Florida, to Israel from the post-Soviet countries in the early 1990s, to different parts of Western and Northern Europe when they uh, took down passport controls in the early 2000s. And none of those economies suffered because of increased sudden and large migration. None of those economies suffered. In fact, they prospered in many regards. Migration, even a lot of migration, in almost all cases, is very good for local, regional, and national economies.
You do not hear anybody talking that way in the US, and nowadays, not even in Canada. A couple of years ago, until very recently, the overall, anything you'd read in the newspaper or something would be celebrating the number of foreign-born people in Canadian society and how lucky we are to have them and how much benefit we're getting from their presence. That's you don't hear that anymore.
You
Uh,
know, I think you do. I think you do, though. I mean, you do, but it doesn't get amplified. So any economist worth their fiscal salt, and there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of studies of this exact thing, they report that mass migration is good for economies. In fact, this has gotten some play, but again, I think it's gotten sort of covered up or ignored. Even the New York Times was reporting about the reason that the United States recovered much better and much more quickly than a lot of other countries after the COVID recession is because there were a lot of migrants who were still coming to the United States. There was, you know, a trillion extra dollars in the federal budget is because of immigration over the past few years. That is something that gets mentioned, but then it just gets covered up by the blather of politicians.
Okay, tell me what you're going to expect. When Trump really gets going with his deportation policy, how much can he actually do? I mean, I take it for granted that he certainly cannot accomplish, he cannot really get rid of millions of people. And what would be the effect if, and what will be the effect on whatever he does by way of breaking up families and taking people off their jobs and trying to, I mean, who's going to pick the fruit and stuff? Tell me more.
I think we'll have to see. I think that there will certainly be chaos and cruelty. I think that there will be a number of quick pushes to really start rounding people up. There'll be some high-profile raids, and there will probably be a number of attempts to stop people from coming across the border. A lot of negotiations with Mexico and Central American countries to try to take back people who are denied and to try to block people from moving further north. People are scared. I've been talking to a lot of folks in the lead up to the inauguration on Monday. People are doing trainings for Border Patrol raids. People are literally bulletproofing some of their housing structures. Um,
Well,
I don't want to.
that would be the people who are expecting to be ousted. But is there any preparation being done by people who or not themselves immigrants, but who don't like the policy. Is there anything being done to shelter people or hide them or protect them or legally defend them?
There is, yeah. I think a lot of immigrant advocacy groups, legal groups are gearing up. They are preparing. And then mutual aid groups are doing know your rights exercises. They're telling people, you don't need to open the door for ICE. They need a warrant. They're trying to create mutual connections so that if there is an arrest, the person's family can be supported. They can be aware of what's going on. There's a lot being done right now, and some of it is as a reporter, even someone who's, in this community, and I've built a lot of relationships, a lot of people are wary of sharing publicly right now because we just don't know who is going to be targeted. Not just immigrants themselves, but people who are supporting them. So I think people are really anxious, and I don't blame them.
Hmm. I don't want to switch gears too much at the last moment, but I do want to ask about something else. I have a lot of friends in Russia,
Mm.
or I used to. With the war, you can't be sure who's your friend anymore. But one of the things is about 1 million men left in a hurry to avoid being mobilized and conscripted and sent to kill Ukrainians. And they are having one hell of a time. They can't get papers to go to Europe or North America, either Canada or the US, easily. And there are very few countries that will let them in. So I've been doing everything I can to, which is not much because there isn't much I can do, um, to try to publicize their plight because I don't know how many of those 1 million are still abroad, but very few of them have gone back to Russia because they'd probably be sent to jail if they did. So I'm concerned about them, and I don't know of any solution on the horizon. I will be setting up another conversation. I've had several with some of these people, but I don't know of any international plan that would change the standards that they apply for allowing people in. And I really would love to think of that. There was something called the Nansen, I believe,
Mm.
close
Mm.
to that word anyway,
That's a Nansen
passport or
passport.
something,
Yeah. Yeah.
when people from Russia needed to be quickly, integrated in other or accepted in other counters.
It
And
wasn't
tell
it
me,
wasn't just it
okay,
wasn't just Russia. It was for stateless people. But a lot of Russians got the Nansen passport, including Vladimir Nabokov. He was a holder of the Nansen passport. And yeah, I think that there is a problem. There are a number of sort of gaps in refugee and asylum protections. And one of the basic ones is just that threshold remains high. Another really huge one is that, you have to prove political persecution for one of the protected grounds. There's 5 protected grounds, and if you can't do that, then you're not eligible for asylum or refugee status. That excludes general warfare. If your country's at war with another country, that is not being seen as being politically persecuted in your own home country. So there's no standard for receiving any person like a refugee or asylum because of general warfare. Also, climate change is not on the list. So
that's terrible.
yeah,
I didn't know that. I mean, if it's, of course, Putin was claiming it's not war anyway. It's what is it
right. Yeah.
called?
A special operation, I think. Yeah.
Special military operation, yes. But I don't even think he's pretending that anymore. I think he uses the word war. But whether he's still sending people to jail for using that word, I don't know. But the main thing is that people don't dare go back. And you're saying that if they left because they were afraid they would be mobilized, we'd say drafted, but they drafted means something different to them. Uh, if they left to avoid going to war because they think that the attack on Ukraine was a terrible idea, and which I think you and I would certainly agree with, at least I would.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with
Why in
you.
the world would anybody want to deny that they are victims of
Well, well,
persecution of some kind?
maybe I said that a little bit too broadly. So if they dodge the draft or whatever it's called, they have been and they could be jailed, or worse. And you are eligible for asylum because of that. But just generally, like if you're in, Western Russia and you're around some of the, warfare that's happening, you could not be able to get asylum for just being under threat, under generalized threat. Same with Ukrainians. We have established a specific parole program in the United States to allow some Ukrainians in, but it's different than asylum and refugee protocols, and so they would not be eligible for those because they're not being persecuted by their own government.
Okay, well, these million men that I'm talking about, I think most of them left within some of them within 24 hours, as soon as the edict came down that they were going to mobilize people, they didn't wait to see whether actually in those days, and I think still, somebody comes to your door and knocks on the door and serves. It's like serving you a war, some kind of document. Then you're hooked once you've accepted it. But
Mhm.
they realized somebody might come to the door. They were recruiting men in their 60s. They were recruiting people with advanced diabetes. They didn't care who they got. They were just scooping up guys. So a million men left. Now, then they don't know where to go. A lot of them, they can go to most of the former Soviet countries, or at
Mhm.
least some of them, like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, and stuff, because they can use internal passports to get there. But if they have, other countries have to have, what the Russians call external passports, that is to go abroad.
Mhm.
And that you can't get. You have to go in Russia to get, the thing. So there are all these guys out there having a hard time, and nobody's taking care of them or helping them. And I think we should be welcoming them with garlands of flowers. These are the people who refuse to go kill Ukrainians.
Well, I certainly agree with you there. This is not quite the world we live in, though, unfortunately. I mean, individuals, even groups can make those efforts, but the politics just aren't there for that setup, really.
Well, we've covered a lot of sad stories. I think very few happy stories so
Yeah,
far, except for the general observation that the people who do get to be immigrants do us a lot of favors and probably benefit by doing it, right? So that
yeah,
good wishes to them all, and I
yeah,
wish that we could do more to help them. So
yeah. Same.
it's been fun. It's been
Yeah,
good.
lovely to talk to you. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Take care. Good wishes for what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Bye
Great.
now.
Bye.